I stood adjusting my civilian navy blazer in front of the mirror, telling myself that today, I was just an ordinary older sister at Coronado. But then, my father's voice rang out, tearing through the hall with an insult that cut like a jagged blade. My Maria is a deserter from glory. She wasn't tough enough to be a warrior. She's only good for office chores. The space around me froze, my chest tightened, a searing pain hitting me like a cold rifle butt to the heart. I gripped the strap of my bag, trying to steady my trembling hands under the weight of this public shame. The orderly world of a high-ranking officer within me shattered against my father's cruelty. He has no idea that this failure, Maria Barker, is actually a vice admiral, holding classified orders he'll never be cleared to touch. Why would a father crush his daughter's honor just for a few minutes of fake glory for her brother? When the truth of those 3 gold stars on my shoulder is finally revealed, will he regret it, or will he let prejudice tear our final bond apart? I took a deep breath, ready to walk into the hall where 20 years of silence was about to end in an unavoidable emotional explosion. The humid Virginia air hung heavy over the backyard, thick with the scent of hickory smoke and charred fat. It was a classic Barker family BBQ, Budweiser in tin buckets, red checkered tablecloths, and the rhythmic thwack of the screen door. But I wasn't a guest. I was the help. I stood over the black iron grill, flipping rack after rack of baby back ribs. The smoke billowed up, stinging my eyes until they watered, though the smoke was merely a convenient excuse for the tears I refused to shed. A few yards away, my father, Robert Barker, sat in his favorite lawn chair, surrounded by his old army buddies. He gestured toward me with his beer bottle, his voice booming for every neighbor to hear. "She didn't amount to much in the Navy," he chuckled, a dry mocking sound that rattled in his chest. "Couldn't hack the real stuff. Now she's just a glorified secretary in Washington, pushing papers and fetching coffee. But look at James over there. Now, that boy carries my blood. A real warrior." I bit my lips so hard I tasted copper. My hands, the same hands that had commanded entire carrier strike groups and mapped out strategic strikes in the Middle East, were now reduced to nothing but grease-stained tools for tongs. Every time I tried to catch his eye, he looked right through me, as if I were a ghost haunting his perfect American lawn. To him, my 20 years of service didn't exist because they didn't involve a muddy trench. Then James stepped out onto the porch. He was wearing his brand new Navy SEAL whites, the sun catching the brass of his trident. He looked radiant, the image of the hero my father always wanted. Robert stood up with a speed his 70-year-old knees shouldn't have allowed, rushing to wrap his arm around my brother's shoulders. "The only hero in this house," my father announced to the crowd. "James is doing what his sister couldn't. He didn't run away when the training got tough. He didn't settle for a desk because he was scared of the dirt." The words felt like a serrated edge drawing across my skin. James looked at me, a smirk playing on his lips, fueled by our father's adoration. He believed the lie as much as Robert did. To them, I was the one who couldn't handle the pressure, the one who took the easy path to DC because I lacked the Barker spine. A neighbor, Mrs. Gable, wandered over to the grill. "Maria, dear, it's been so long. What is it you're doing at the Pentagon exactly? It sounds so important." Before I could even draw breath to answer, my father's voice cut in, sharp and dismissive. "She prints memos and makes sure the real officers have their donuts, Betty. Don't get her started, or she'll start crying like she did the day she quit the academy." A wave of laughter rippled through the yard. I stood there, paralyzed, the tongs frozen in midair. The isolation was absolute. In this sea of familiar faces, I was a stranger, an outcast draped in a cloak of perceived failure. The weight of their contempt pressed down on my shoulders like 1,000 pounds of lead. I couldn't stay out there anymore. I handed the tongs to a confused cousin and retreated into the house. The cool air of the kitchen was a relief, but the silence inside was louder than the party outside. I reached into the pocket of my blazer and felt the cold, hard gold of my 3-star officer's ring. It was a heavy piece of metal, a symbol of 2 decades of classified missions and responsibilities that kept the world turning. My mother was leaning against the counter, drying a glass. She looked at me with soft, pitying eyes. The kind of look you give a wounded animal. She didn't say a word. She never did. She wouldn't cross Robert, not even to defend her firstborn daughter. I thought about General George Patton's words. Glory is a team effort, but failure is a lonely burden. I took a slow, jagged breath, forcing the lump in my throat back down. I wasn't a failure. I was a Vice Admiral of the United States Navy. The truth didn't change just because of the lies others told. I would endure this humiliation. I would let him have his BBQ, because the countdown to Coronado had begun. Soon, the truth would have its day. I know many of you listening have felt this exact same sting, the pain of being the one who does the work while someone else gets the praise. If you believe Maria deserves to have her honor restored, please take a second to hit the like button to support her journey. And if you've ever felt overlooked by the people who should have loved you most, just comment the word strength below. It lets us know we aren't walking this lonely road alone. Your likes and comments help Maria's story reach more people who need to hear it. The silence of the kitchen was my only companion for now, but tomorrow, the world would finally see who Maria Barker really is. The Barker kitchen was suffocating, thick with the smell of extra crispy fried chicken and years of unspoken resentment. A massive platter of golden brown thighs and breasts sat in the center of the table, a greasy trophy for James's existence, while the scent of heavy gravy hung in the humid air like a fog. Robert sat at the head of the table, his face flushed a deep, weathered red as he poured another generous glass of bourbon. The sharp clink of his glass against the bottle sounded like a judge's gavel, and I was the one constantly on trial. If you had just an ounce of the grit your brother has, Maria, you wouldn't be a glorified gopher, he said, waving a chicken drumstick toward me. James sat opposite me, his chest puffed out, soaking in the praise like a dry sponge. You'd be out there making this family proud instead of pushing paper in some windowless basement in D.C. It's a crying shame to see a Barker wasting away behind a desk. I didn't argue. I didn't even look up. I just took a slow bite of the mashed potatoes. They were salty, but not as bitter as the irony sitting in my gut. I looked at James, my little brother, who was so incredibly proud of the deployment orders he'd just received. He had no idea that I was the one who had spent the last 72 hours in a secure facility, personally approving the intelligence maps and the tactical schematics for his team's mission. I knew the exact coordinates of every threat he would face, while he barely knew how to lace his own combat boots without a sergeant checking them. Robert wasn't finished. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet-lined box, its edges frayed and gray from years of being handled. With a heavy thud, he placed his old bronze star on the table, right next to my plate. It looked small and insignificant against the vastness of his contempt for me. "Pick it up, Maria," he commanded, his gravelly voice dropping an octave. "Hold it. I want you to feel what actual honor feels like. It's a heavy thing, something a quitter who ran from the academy will never get to touch. It's the weight of a man who didn't back down when things got bloody." I reached out, my fingers brushing the cold, pitted metal of the metal. My heart twisted, not with shame, but with a weary kind of pity. My father had no way of knowing that I had dozens of these, along with distinguished service medals that were tucked away in a high-security vault at the Pentagon, far from his prying, judgmental eyes. To him, this piece of metal was the peak of human achievement. To me, it was a reminder of the cost of the silence I had to maintain to keep men like him safe and comfortable in their prejudices. Suddenly, the heavy vibration of my secure phone rattled in the pocket of my blazer. The specific rhythmic pulse told me exactly who was calling. I cleared my throat and pushed back my chair, the wooden legs scraping harshly against the linoleum. "Excuse me, I need to take this. It's work." Robert let out a sharp, mocking snort. "Go on then. Is the boss calling to find out where his donuts are? Or did you run out of printer toner again?" James let out a muffled laugh, his mouth full of chicken, his eyes dancing with a cruel delight. I walked away from the warm light of the dining room and into the shadows of the dark hallway. As soon as the kitchen door swung shut, my entire posture shifted. The tired daughter vanished, and the Vice Admiral took her place. I flipped the phone open and spoke into the encrypted line with a voice like sharpened steel. "Barker here," I said. "Ma'am, this is Colonel Matthews," a crisp voice replied from thousands of miles away. "The Fifth Fleet is on station in the Gulf. We have visual on the target crossing the maritime boundary. We are green across the board and awaiting your direct authorization to proceed with the engagement." "Understood, Colonel," I replied, staring at a framed photo of James on the hallway wall. "Maintain a defensive posture, but if they cross the line, you are authorized to engage. Open fire. Do not let them breach the perimeter. Is that clear?" "Crystal clear, Vice Admiral. Orders received. We are moving to intercept now." I closed the phone and stood in the dark for a long moment. My heart was pounding, not from the order I'd just given, but from the staggering, impossible distance between my high worlds. I took a slow, steadying breath and whispered the words I'd carried since my first day at sea. "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me." When I walked back into the kitchen, Robert was still laughing, mid-story about some bar fight he'd gotten into 40 years ago. He looked at me and shook his head, his eyes full of dismissive pity. "Did the boss give you an earful? Probably messed up the filing again, didn't you?" I sat back down and picked up my fork. I looked at the old man across from me, a man who had spent his life building a monument to his own ego out of the scraps of his daughter's dignity. I wondered if his heart could even handle the shock if I told him the truth. The storm was coming, and I was the one who had summoned the lightning. The air at Naval Base Coronado was thick with the scent of salt spray and the heavy metallic tang of JP-5 jet fuel. Overhead, the rhythmic thrum of MH-60 Seahawk helicopters vibrated in my chest, a familiar frequency that usually felt like home. But today, it felt like an approaching storm. I walked several paces behind my father, Robert, as we approached the main security checkpoint. He walked with a performative swagger, his shoulders squared as if he were still leading a platoon in the Highlands, clutching the VIP guest passes for James's SEAL graduation like they were his own commission. When we reached the young master-at-arms at the gate, Robert didn't just show his ID, he brandished it. He leaned in, his voice loud and patronizing as he pointed back at me with a dismissive thumb. "I've got the primary passes for the family seating, son. This one here is just a domestic helper we brought along to carry the gear. She doesn't need the VIP access. Just put her in the civilian overflow or wherever the staff waits." The young sailor looked from Robert to me, his eyes landing on my civilian blazer and quiet expression. He hesitated, his training sensing something he couldn't quite name, a posture that didn't match the helper label. For a split second, I saw him start to lean in to check my secondary ID. I gave him a nearly imperceptible shake of my head, a silent, stand-down order that only one officer understands from another. He blinked, swallowed hard, and stepped back, snapping a crisp, slightly confused salute to my father. Robert chuckled, a dry, arrogant sound. "See that, Maria? Even the guards know the difference between a real soldier and someone like you. Without me, you wouldn't even have the right to breathe the air on this base. You're lucky I let you tag along at all." I said nothing. I kept my eyes on the horizon, the blinding California sun reflecting off the Pacific. I thought about the words of Martin Luther King Jr. "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." In this microcosm of my family, the injustice was so complete it had become the air we breathed. Robert believed that honor was something he could gatekeep, unaware that I had spent more time on bases like this than he had spent in his entire career. Inside the graduation hall, the atmosphere was electric with tradition. The room was a sea of dress whites and polished brass. Robert and my mother were ushered to the front row, the honored families section, where they sat beneath the massive draped flags. Robert turned around, spotting me standing in the very last row of the overflow section, tucked into a dusty corner near the service entrance. He glared at me and made a sharp, downward motion with his hand, signaling for me to bow my head and keep my eyes on the floor. "Don't you dare look up," he hissed under his breath as people passed. "Don't embarrass James in front of his teammates. Just stay in the shadows where you belong and act like you're invisible." I leaned my back against the cold concrete wall, my hands clenched into tight knots behind my back. My heart was screaming for the justice my father had denied me for 2 decades, but the Admiral in me remained a statue. Then came the sound, the rhythmic, synchronized thunder of jump boots hitting the floor. The graduating SEALs marched in, a wall of lean muscle and iron will. They were the tip of the spear, the finest warriors our nation produced. Robert watched them with a look of pure, unadulterated worship, his eyes glistening. He leaned back toward me, his voice a venomous whisper. "Look at them, Maria. Look at real men. They are the reason this country is safe while you sit in your air-conditioned office wasting tax dollars. They are warriors. You are just a burden we've had to carry." I stared at the back of James's head in the front row. My father's words were a heavy weight, but my knowledge was heavier. I sat there in silence, the burden, the maid, the clerk, knowing that I was the one who had signed the deployment orders for these men. I was the one who had cleared the Black Ops budget for the very mission they would be departing for next Tuesday. They were the spear, but I was the hand that aimed it. Suddenly, the room went dead silent. The side doors opened and a 4-star general stepped onto the stage, General Miller, the commander of all special operations. The air in the room seemed to vanish as everyone snapped to attention. Miller stood at the podium, his chest a tapestry of valor, his eyes sharp as a hawk's. He began to scan the room, his gaze moving slowly across the rows of families. His eyes passed over James. They passed over Robert, who was leaning forward, practically begging for a glance. And then, Miller's eyes stopped. They locked onto the very back corner of the room. They locked onto me. I saw the general's brow furrow, a flicker of genuine confusion and then realization crossing his face. He looked at my civilian clothes, my position in the overflow seating, and back to the front row where my family sat. A storm began to brew in his expression. Robert, oblivious as ever, whispered excitedly to my mother, "Look, General Miller is looking right at James. He knows James is a legend already." But Robert was wrong. The storm wasn't for James. It was for the man who had forced a vice admiral to sit in the dirt. The California sun was an unyielding hammer, beating down on the asphalt of Coronado with a relentless 95-degree fury. The air was a thick soup of salt, heat, and the sharp chemical tang of sunscreen. As the midday break began, my father, Robert, shoved a heavy blue igloo cooler toward me, its plastic wheels rattling loudly against the pavement. It was packed to the brim with ice and dozens of plastic Dasani water bottles. "Don't just stand there like a statue, Maria," Robert barked, his voice booming across the courtyard, intentionally drawing the attention of a group of passing naval officers. "Go on, be useful for once. Hand these out to the veterans and the guests. At least you can manage to hand out water since you couldn't manage to handle a real career. It's better than sitting in that air-conditioned office in DC doing absolutely nothing." I gripped the freezing plastic handles, the weight of the cooler pulling at my joints. As I moved, the melting ice sloshed over the edges, soaking my hands and dripping down my civilian blazer. These were the same hands that had signed national security treaties and authorized billion-dollar defense budgets. Now, they were covered in dirty ice water, serving as a public spectacle of my father's disdain. He wanted everyone to see it. He wanted to anchor me to the role of a servant in the very place where I should have been honored. As I leaned over to pull out a bottle for an elderly veteran, a shadow fell over me. I looked up and froze. Standing there, crisp and immaculate in her summer white uniform, was Captain Sarah Jenkins. 5 years ago, she had been my lead intelligence officer at the 5th Fleet. Her eyes went wide, her jaw nearly dropping as she took in the sight of me, soaked in ice water, hauling a plastic cooler like a hired laborer. "Ma'am, Vice Admi..." Sarah started, her hand automatically rising to her brow for a sharp, instinctive salute. I gave her a quick, desperate shake of my head, a silent command to stop. But Robert had already stepped between us, his face twisting into a patronizing grin. He didn't see a captain, he saw a high-ranking officer he could impress by belittling his daughter. "Don't mind her, Captain," Robert interrupted, his tone dripping with mock apology. "That's just my daughter, Maria. She's the family failure. We just brought her along to help out with the heavy lifting since she's used to being a subordinate anyway. She's just a clerk, you see." Doesn't know the first thing about real military life. Sarah looked at my father with a gaze of pure, unadulterated horror. She looked at me, then back at him, her face flushing with a mix of confusion and mounting rage. I felt the humiliation sink into my very marrow, colder than the ice in my hands. To be called a failure in front of the woman who had watched me lead a fleet into combat was a special kind of agony. When Robert finally wandered off to brag to another group of guests, Sarah followed me behind a stack of equipment crates. The courtyard was humming with chatter, but between us there was only a vibrating silence. "Ma'am, what is happening?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "Why are you letting him talk to you like that? You are Vice Admiral Maria Barker. You're the woman who saved my entire battalion in Syria when the intel went dark. We owe you our lives." I looked at her, the Coronado sun making my eyes sting. I could see the reflection of my own exhaustion in her polished brass buttons. "Because today is for James, Sarah," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "And because there are truths so heavy they would burn my father to the ground if he knew them. He's an old man living in a dream he built out of my perceived failures. Let him have today." Sarah stood there, tears welling in her eyes. She reached out, her hand hovering near my arm, but she didn't touch me. She understood the weight of the sacrifice, the quiet, agonizing choice to be erased so someone else could shine. I thought of the words of Ronald Reagan. "There is no limit to the amount of good you can do if you don't care who gets the credit." "It's not right," Sarah whispered. "It's just not right." She stepped back and, despite my earlier warning, she stood perfectly straight and offered me the most respectful, crisp salute I had ever received. It was a salute of pure, heart-wrenching recognition. I didn't see James standing 10 feet away, hidden by the shadow of a transport truck. He had been looking for a water bottle, but he had stopped, frozen. He had seen the salute. He had heard the words, "Vice Admiral," and "Syria." His brow was deeply furrowed, his eyes darting between me and the retreating captain. "Maria," James called out, his voice cracking slightly. "What did she just call you? What was she saying about a battalion?" Robert appeared out of nowhere, grabbing James by the shoulder. "She didn't say anything, James. The girl is confused, probably had too much sun. Don't listen to Maria's office friends. Come on, the final ceremony is starting. This is your moment, son." James let himself be pulled away, but he looked back over his shoulder at me. For the first time in 20 years, the look in his eyes wasn't contempt. It was a terrifying, dawning realization. The door to the truth had finally been unbolted, and the light was starting to bleed through. The Coronado Auditorium was a massive cathedral of military pride, smelling of industrial floor wax, heavy laundry starch, and the nervous sweat of 1,000 people. While the important guests were ushered to the plush, velvet-cushioned seats near the stage, my father, Robert, made sure I stayed exactly where he thought I belonged. He grabbed my arm and shoved me toward a dusty, shadow-filled spot at the very end of the aisle in the back row, right next to the heavy metal exit doors. "Stand here and observe your brother's success, Maria," Robert hissed, his eyes narrowed with a cruel kind of satisfaction. "Maybe you'll learn a little something about the courage you managed to lose. This is a room for warriors, not for paper pushers who couldn't handle the heat. Don't move, and try not to let anyone know you're related to us." I leaned my back against the cold, rough concrete wall. The dust from the floor seemed to cling to the hem of my blazer, a physical manifestation of the low regard my family held for me. I looked up at the stage, draped in massive American flags and glowing under the intense spotlights. I felt like a stranger in my own life, a ghost haunted by the very blood that ran through my veins. I thought about the 20 years of letters I'd sent home, detailed, handwritten accounts of my promotions, my commands, and the sacrifices I had made. My mother once told me that Robert took those letters, unopened, and threw them into a greasy drawer in his garage workbench. He had spent 2 decades carefully curating a lie of my failure, simply because he couldn't accept that his daughter was the one who had reached the heights he had only dreamed of. I closed my eyes, silently reciting the words of Proverbs 10:9. "He that walketh uprightly walketh surely, but he that perverteth his ways shall be known." Suddenly, the room went bone-chillingly silent. General Miller stepped up to the microphone. His voice didn't just carry through the speakers, it vibrated in the floorboards, a deep, gravelly thunder that commanded every soul in the building to hold their breath. Today, we honor these new SEALs. Miller began, his eyes scanning the crowd with the intensity of a hawk. We honor their grit and their iron will. But there is a person in this room today whose name you will not find on any program. Someone whose quiet, tireless dedication and strategic brilliance kept every single one of these men alive during their final training phases and their upcoming deployments. A low murmur rippled through the hall. Robert leaned forward, a delusional, triumphant smile spreading across his face. He leaned over to my mother and whispered loud enough for the rows around him to hear, "He's talking about me. He knows I'm the one who raised James to be a killer. He's honoring the Barker legacy and the way I built that boy's character." I felt my heart hammer against my ribs, a rhythmic drumming that felt like it might burst through my chest. I watched James in the front row. He wasn't smiling. He was sitting perfectly still, his head tilted slightly to the side, his earlier suspicion from the courtyard clearly gnawing at his mind. He was looking at the general, and then he slowly turned his head to look back at me, standing in the shadows of the back row. General Miller didn't look at the dignitaries. He didn't look at the rows of proud parents in the front. His sharp gaze was fixed on the very back of the hall. Robert noticed the general's focus and scoffed, turning back to mock me one last time. "Look at that girl. She's so ashamed she won't even lift her head. She knows she's a disgrace to everything this room stands for." He didn't know that my lowered head was the only thing keeping my 3-star authority from shattering his reality right then and there. Suddenly, without a word of warning, General Miller stepped away from the podium. The silence in the room became absolute, so quiet you could hear the distant cry of a seagull outside. Miller stepped down the stairs of the stage, his polished jump boots hitting the floor with a rhythmic, heavy thud, thud, thud that sounded like a countdown to an explosion. He began to walk. Not toward the exits, and not toward the VIPs. He walked straight down the center aisle, moving with the unstoppable momentum of a tidal wave. As he approached the front row, Robert stood up with a broad, eager grin, extending his hand for a handshake. "General Miller, sir, I'm Robert Barker, James's father. It's an absolute honor to—" Miller didn't even blink. He moved past Robert like the man was made of thin smoke, his shoulder brushing past my father's outstretched arm without a second glance. Robert froze, his hand hanging in empty air, his face turning a confused, mottled purple. The general didn't stop. He kept walking, his eyes locked onto mine. Every head in the auditorium turned, following his path toward the back of the room. The key to the secret was turning in the lock. The footsteps of justice were finally at my feet, and the silence of 20 years was over. General Miller stopped exactly 3 paces in front of me. The silence in the auditorium was no longer just a lack of noise, it was a physical weight, a suffocating vacuum that seemed to suck the oxygen right out of the room. My father, Robert, stood frozen just a few feet away, his hand still awkwardly extended in the air, his face a mask of profound, stuttering confusion. He looked at the general, then at me, then back at the general, his brain clearly unable to process the collision of his 2 realities. He stood there like a man who had been struck by lightning but hadn't realized he was dead yet. Then, the world shifted on its axis. General Miller, the most powerful and decorated man in the building, snapped his polished heels together and offered me a salute so crisp, so perfect, that it seemed to vibrate with the force of his entire military career. "Vice Admiral Barker." Miller's voice boomed, carrying to every single corner of the massive hall without the slightest need for a microphone. "It is a profound and distinct honor to see you here today, ma'am. We certainly didn't expect the Pentagon's most brilliant strategic mind to be standing back here in the overflow section among the civilians." The moment those words left his lips, something truly extraordinary happened. As if triggered by a single, powerful electric current, the 200 newly graduated Navy SEALs in the front rows stood up in perfect unison. The sound of their heavy jump boots hitting the polished wooden floor was a single, violent crack. A thunderclap that shook the very foundation of the building and rattled the glass in the high windows. Like a massive wave of white and brass, they snapped to attention, their eyes fixed forward with a discipline that was terrifying in its intensity. "Good morning, Vice Admiral!" they roared together, their voices merging into a single, deafening wall of sound that echoed off the high rafters and seemed to vibrate in my very bones. In that instant, the massive monolith that was my father's ego finally crumbled into dust. I watched as Robert Barker's face went from a mottled, angry purple to a ghostly, sickly white. The hand he had held out so eagerly to the general dropped to his side like a lead weight. But the most symbolic moment was when his old Army veteran cap, the one he had worn like a crown of thorns while he insulted me all morning, slipped from his trembling fingers and hit the dusty floor with a soft, final thud. His lips moved, but no sound came out. He was a man witnessing the total and absolute annihilation of his own world. General Miller didn't look away from me, but his voice turned into a sheet of sub-zero ice as he addressed the man standing beside him. "Mr. Barker, I truly hope you realize the incredible magnitude of the woman standing before you right now. Your daughter is not just an officer, she's the lead architect behind the strike packages that keep this nation's enemies at bay every single night. In fact, if it weren't for the intelligence schematics and the tactical assets she personally authorized 3 weeks ago, your son likely wouldn't have survived the 3rd week of the most dangerous training phase in the entire world." The words hit Robert like a physical blow to the chest. He stumbled back, his legs finally giving way as he practically collapsed into his velvet-cushioned chair. He covered his face with his weathered, shaking hands, the shame finally changing owners after 20 long years of silence. The maid, the clerk, the disgrace, was, in fact, the silent savior of his only son. I stepped out of the shadows of the back row. I didn't feel like a victim anymore. I didn't feel small or invisible. I stood tall, my shoulders squared, and my head held high, the authority I had carried for 2 decades finally manifesting in the light of day. I looked toward the front row, catching James's eye. My brother was staring at me, his steel trident glinting on his chest, but his expression was one of absolute awe and soul-crushing guilt. He finally saw me, not as the sister he had outshone, but as the commander he could only hope to emulate. I thought of the words of Jesus in John 8:32, "And ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." For 20 years, the lie had been a prison for all of us, but today, the walls had been blown apart by the thunder of 200 heroes. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to seek revenge. The truth was loud enough. If seeing Maria finally get the respect she earned made your heart swell with pride, please hit that like button right now. And to show Robert that the truth always wins, type the word proud in the comments below. Let's let Maria know she isn't invisible anymore. I walked slowly down the center aisle, the crowd parting for me like the Red Sea. I was Maria Barker, Vice Admiral of the United States Navy, and for the first time in my life, I was finally home. After the thunderous salutes of the graduation ceremony, the silence of the evening felt like a physical blow to my chest. I didn't stay for the champagne, the forced laughter, or the awkward backslapping of the reception. I needed to breathe air that didn't smell like military protocol or polished brass. I walked alone along the edge of the Pacific, letting the sharp points of my high heels sink deep into the cool, damp sand of Coronado Beach. Each step was a struggle, a deliberate effort to pull myself forward, much like the last 20 years of my life had been. The rhythm of the crashing waves sounded like a massive, churning machine, trying to wash away the echoes of my father's insults. I should have been triumphant. I had been vindicated in the most public way possible. Yet, as the salt spray hit my face, I felt a devastating sense of emptiness. My shoulders, though finally unburdened by the weight of my father's lies, felt heavier than they ever had before. I realized then that the 3 gold stars on my blazer didn't just represent power. They represented the staggering, lonely cost of the bridge I had to burn to reach them. In the base parking lot, the atmosphere was even colder. My father sat in the driver's seat of his old Ford F-150, a truck that usually roared with his confidence and reflected his pride. Now, it was just a silent, hollow cage of rusted steel. I watched him from a distance as he tried to insert the key into the ignition. His hands, those rough, powerful hands that had built a machine shop and a reputation for being unbreakable, were shaking like dry leaves in a Virginia gale. He couldn't align the silver key with the lock. He stared at the dashboard, his breathing shallow and ragged. I saw his eyes flick toward the rearview mirror, catching my reflection as I approached the truck. For the first time in his 70 years, the Iron Man of Richmond looked genuinely afraid. He didn't look at me with his usual anger or dismissive pity anymore. He looked at me with a primal kind of terror. He was realizing that the daughter he had treated like a servant was a titan he had never truly known, and he was terrified of the retribution he thought was coming. The journey back to the East Coast was a hollow, echoing nightmare. James walked up to me before we boarded the plane, his typical swagger gone and his seal whites looking rumpled. "Maria," he whispered, his voice cracking like a young boy's. I didn't know. I honestly had no idea. I offered him a thin, weary smile that didn't reach my tired eyes. "You didn't need to know, James. That was my mission, not yours." The flight back to Richmond was spent in a silence so thick it felt like it might choke us all. Robert sat in the row directly across from me, his gaze fixed permanently on the gray clouds outside the small window. He wouldn't look at my mother, he wouldn't look at James, and he certainly wouldn't look at me. The silence was a deadly thing, a void where his arrogance used to be. I sat back and remembered a quote by Billy Graham. "Forgiveness is the highest form of love. It requires a person to be stronger than the one who caused the pain." I closed my eyes and wondered if I was actually strong enough to bridge this gap. We arrived at the old family house in Richmond under the cover of a moonless, heavy sky. The air here was different. Sweeter, smelling of ancient oak trees and the faint, bitter scent of burnt grass from the neighboring fields. It was the smell of my childhood, but tonight it felt like a warning of things to come. My father didn't help with the bags. He walked straight through the front door, his head down, and disappeared into his office, slamming the heavy wooden door shut behind him. I stood in the living room, the house creaking with age around me. My eyes drifted to the walls, which were covered in James's framed certificates and sports trophies, a shrine to the warrior son. Then I looked at the dark corner behind a dusty, oversized ceramic vase. My own honors, my graduation diploma from the academy, was tucked away there, forgotten and gray with neglect. I let out a long, ragged sigh that seemed to echo through the empty halls. I had found justice at Coronado, but this house was still a tomb of old prejudices. The real battle to reclaim my family was just beginning. The Virginia night was thick and heavy, saturated with the scent of damp pine needles and the humid, sweet air of the late southern summer. I sat on the old, weathered wooden rocking chair on the back porch, my fingers tracing the cold condensation on a tall glass of sweet tea. The yellow bug light above the screen door hummed with a low electric vibration, casting a jaundiced and flickering glow over the peeling white paint of the porch railing. Beyond the circle of light, the woods were alive with the rhythmic, pulsing choir of crickets and the distant, lonely call of a whippoorwill. It was the kind of profound silence that usually invited peace, but tonight it felt like a high-stakes trial. Then I heard the screen door creak, that familiar metallic groan that hadn't changed since I was 6 years old. My father, Robert, stepped out into the night. He didn't have his usual performative swagger. His shoulders were slumped, his chest hollow, and his breathing was heavy and labored, as if he were carrying the physical weight of every lie he had ever told. He walked over to the small wicker table and set down a bottle of high-end bourbon, the expensive, small-batch stuff he only opened for weddings, funerals, or the birth of a grandson. He didn't look at me. He couldn't. He just reached for 2 small, heavy-bottomed glasses and began to pour, the amber liquid catching the dim light as it splashed against the glass. He handed me a drink, and for the first time in 20 years, his hand didn't just graze mine. It lingered, his skin feeling like rough parchment. "I spent a long time telling myself you were a total failure, Maria," he started, his voice a jagged, gravelly whisper that barely made it past the edge of the porch. "I needed you to be a failure. I've spent 20 years carefully building a monster out of your name just so I could have a place to dump my own bitter disappointments. I thought if I yelled loud enough and humiliated you often enough, I could somehow drown out the terrifying truth of how much I had actually failed you as a father." He took a long, slow sip of the bourbon, his throat working hard to swallow the liquid and the pride that had choked him for decades. He reached into the front pocket of his worn flannel shirt and pulled out a tiny, crumpled, and badly yellowed piece of paper. It was a clipping from an old military newspaper from 5 years ago. I recognized it instantly. It was a brief mention of a classified commendation for an anonymous female officer. My name had been in the first leaked draft, before the official censors got to it. "I saw this," he whispered, his eyes finally meeting mine, and they were filled with a soul-crushing kind of regret I never thought he was capable of feeling. "I saw the name Maria Barker on a list of national heroes. And do you know what I did? I tore it up. I threw it in the trash and went out to the garage to drink because I was absolutely terrified. I was terrified that my daughter was a better, braver soldier than I ever was. I didn't want to believe you were brilliant or powerful because that meant I had spent half my life being wrong about everything." He paused, a single heavy tear rolling down his weathered, wrinkled cheek. "I burned your letters too. Every single one you sent over the last 20 years. I threw them into the workshop furnace without even opening them because I couldn't handle the success I knew was written inside. I'm a small, bitter man, Maria. I'm a coward who hid behind his own daughter's grace." I looked at the clipping, then at the man who had spent 2 decades trying to erase my existence. The anger I had carried, the white-hot, disciplined fury that had sustained me through the academy and the long, lonely nights at sea, simply evaporated. It was replaced by a staggering, quiet pity. I reached out and placed my hand over his trembling, grease-stained palm. "I didn't need you to see the Vice Admiral, Dad," I said softly, the words feeling like a prayer in the night. "I didn't need the 3 stars or the salutes to prove I was worthy of this family. I just needed you to see me. Just your daughter." Robert's head dropped onto the table, his entire frame shaking with the kind of violent, racking sobs that only a man who has held back a lifetime of shame can produce. He cried for the 20 years he had stolen, for the lies he had told James, and for the father he had utterly failed to be. "I'm so sorry," he choked out between gasps. "God, Maria, I'm so sorry." I stood up and pulled him into a hug. He felt smaller than I remembered, his bones more fragile under his shirt. The scent of motor oil and old tobacco, the smell of my childhood, wrapped around me, but tonight it didn't feel like a threat. It felt like an apology. I remembered the words from the Gospel of Luke, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Robert hadn't known. He had been blinded by his own broken pride, and tonight the scales had finally fallen from his eyes. We sat there for a long time under the stars, the bourbon untouched, as we began to pick up the pieces. The truth had finally set us both free, and the bridge we were building wasn't made of rank, but of the simple, agonizing grace of a second chance. Sunday morning in Virginia is a specific kind of quiet. The sun spilled through the kitchen windows in long golden shafts, catching the steam rising from a fresh pot of Arabica coffee. The air was a rich symphony of Sunday aromas. The sweet, buttery scent of pancakes on the griddle and the salty, smoky sizzle of thick-cut bacon in my mother's favorite cast-iron skillet. James was standing by the stove, clumsily helping Mom flip the eggs, his new seal trident catching the light. My father, Robert, was sitting in his usual spot at the head of the table, the Richmond Times-Dispatch spread out before him. When I walked into the room, something extraordinary happened. Robert didn't just glance up. He folded his paper, stood up, and pulled out the chair beside him. It was a gesture of profound old-world respect he usually reserved only for visiting dignitaries. "Good morning, Maria," he said, his voice warm and devoid of the jagged edge that had defined our relationship for 20 years. A genuine, crinkled smile played across his weathered face as he reached for the coffee pot. "Your coffee, Vice Admiral. I made sure it was hot, just the way you like it." There was no mockery in his tone, no hidden barb in his words. For the first time, he wasn't looking at the clerk or the failure he had invented. He was looking at his daughter, the commander, and he was seeing her with a deep, humble pride that made my heart feel lighter than a Pacific breeze. An hour later, we walked into our local church, the same red brick building where I had felt the sting of 1,000 judgmental whispers for high decades. The neighbors were still looking at me with those same old, pitying eyes, their expressions frozen in the memory of the Barker girl who couldn't hack the Navy. But Robert didn't let that last for a second. He walked into the sanctuary with his head held high, his hand resting firmly on my shoulder. When the pastor stood up to recognize James's graduation, my father stood up as well. His voice was firm and resonant, carrying to the very back of the hall. "We are blessed to have James back," Robert announced to the congregation, his voice booming with a newfound pride. "But I also want you all to welcome home my daughter, Maria. She's a vice admiral at the Pentagon now, and she's just back from Coronado. She's the real hero of the Barker house, and I couldn't be more honored to be her father." A wave of stunned silence rippled through the pews, followed by a sea of wide-eyed looks. I didn't feel the need to hide or shrink away. For the first time in Richmond, I felt like I truly belonged. That afternoon, the house was filled with the familiar, comforting sound of a hammer and saw. I found Robert in the living room, meticulously building a new display case out of dark, polished oak. He was clearing away the dusty trophies and old certificates that had dominated the wall for years. With careful, trembling hands, he began to arrange my dress-white uniform and my officer's sword in the center of the case. He stopped to rub a smudge off one of the 3 gold stars on the shoulder board. "I want every person who walks through that front door or visits my machine shop to know exactly who you are, Maria," he said softly, his eyes never leaving the uniform. "I want them to know that a hero lives in this house. I spent 20 years hiding your light under a bushel, but no more. This town needs to know what a Barker can really do." The pain of 20 years seemed to evaporate in the scent of fresh sawdust and the warmth of his gaze. The following morning, we stood at Richmond International Airport. The air was crisp, the sky a brilliant, cloudless blue. Robert pulled me into a hug that felt different. It was a hug that carried the familiar scent of motor oil and tobacco. But today it was wrapped in a new, unshakable love. "Go on back to Washington and do your job, Maria," he whispered into my ear. "Just know that your father is sitting right here in Richmond, waiting to hear from you. We're proud of you, honey." As I boarded the plane, I looked down at the Virginia landscape, the rolling hills and the winding James River. I thought about the words of Eleanor Roosevelt. "The future belongs to those who believe in the beauty of their dreams." I wasn't the lonely ghost of the Barker family anymore. I was a daughter who had finally been brought in from the cold. A new dawn had finally risen, and for the first time in 20 years, the light was absolutely blinding and beautiful. I stood at the polished wooden podium of the United States Naval Academy in Annapolis. Below me, a vast sea of midshipmen in their immaculate summer whites stretched across the historic courtyard, a vision of absolute discipline and hope. It was the very embodiment of the American spirit I had sworn to protect. The air was sharp with the Severn River's scent and the electric energy of a new generation ready to serve. In the front row, in the seat of honor, sat my father, Robert Barker. He wasn't the broken man I had left in the shadows of our Richmond home. He sat with his spine straight, his head held high, his eyes shimmering with a quiet, fierce pride that I no longer had to fight for. Looking out at those eager faces, I didn't see strangers. I saw myself 20 years ago, lonely, misunderstood, and carrying a secret fire that the world and my own family had tried to extinguish. I didn't begin my commencement speech with a list of strategic victories. I began with the crushing weight of the silence I had carried for 20 years. "It is not the critic who counts," I said, my voice projecting through the speakers and echoing off the historic stone walls of Bancroft Hall. "It is not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles. The credit belongs to the person who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by the dust and sweat and blood of the struggle." I looked directly at my father as I spoke those iconic words of Theodore Roosevelt. He gave me a slow nod, a single tear tracing a path through the deep wrinkles of his face. I spoke to the midshipmen about the silent battles, the ones fought in windowless rooms at the Pentagon and on the darkened porches of our own homes. I wanted them to understand that the truth is like a lighthouse. It might be obscured by the thickest fog of prejudice and lies for years, but it never stops shining. Its light is patient, and eventually the fog clears to reveal the rock upon which we stand. Integrity is not what people see. It is what you do when no one is looking. Then, with a voice that didn't waver, I announced the founding of the Silent Heroes Scholarship Fund. I named it after my mother, the woman who had bravely kept our family from crumbling while the storms of my father's ego raged. This fund is specifically for those being told by the world that you aren't good enough, I said, the words resonating in the Academy's silence. It is for the ones whose greatest sacrifices are made in the shadows, unobserved and unthanked. I watched with a full heart as my father stood up and walked onto the stage. His steps were measured and heavy with a new purpose. He stood beside me under the massive American flag, his rough hand gripping mine with a strength that spoke of total redemption. Together, we presented the first award to a brilliant midshipman from Virginia. In that moment, the conflicts of 20 years, the insults, the humiliation, and the burned letters were laid to rest. It was the ultimate victory of love over a blind pride. We were no longer two strangers. We were a family forged in the fire of truth. The story truly reached its conclusion weeks later, as I stood alone on the vast flight deck of the USS Abraham Lincoln. We were deep in the Pacific, and the sun was beginning its majestic descent, painting the sky in violent shades of orange, purple, and gold. I was no longer a victim of my father's disdain or the ghost of my family's past. I was a person who had successfully architected her own future. The tragedy of being overlooked had become my greatest leadership strength. It had given me the empathy to recognize the quiet excellence in others that the world often ignores. I reached up and touched the cold weight of the 3 gold stars on my shoulder boards. The truth had finally set me free, and the love of my family had finally brought me home. A salt-heavy wind caught my hair, carrying the call of a new mission. I took a deep, steadying breath, standing tall in the commanding silence of my own authority. I knew exactly who I was, and for the first time in my life, I knew exactly where I belonged. I looked toward the horizon, ready to meet the dawn, carrying the words of Isaiah in my heart. Here am I, send me. Looking back, my journey wasn't just about earning stars. It was about protecting the light inside me when the world tried to tell me I was invisible. The most valuable lesson I can share is this. Your worth is not a negotiation. Never let someone else's inability to see your value define your reality. Integrity is a long game. It requires a quiet strength that doesn't need to shout to be true. When you stay faithful to your purpose, the truth doesn't just eventually surface. It becomes a foundation that can never be shaken by anyone's prejudice or judgment. Thank you for standing by me through this storm. It means the world to me to know my story has reached you. If Maria's journey touched your heart or reminded you of your own inner strength, please support our channel by hitting the like button and subscribing. Your support is what allows us to keep sharing these powerful stories of resilience and hope with the world. Before you go, I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to stay silent while waiting for the truth to speak? Comment the word faith below. I'll be reading. God bless.